So we're picking up in the book of Habakkuk this morning, and starting at verse 5. Habakkuk has raised his issue with the Lord, and this is the reply. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 5. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations, look and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. On they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like sand. They scoff at kings and princes and scorn all their fortresses. They simply pile ramps of earth against their walls and capture them. They sweep past like the wind and are gone. But they are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God." May the Lord open his word to our hearts this morning. So we started last week with Habakkuk, short little Old Testament book from a prophet. Habakkuk is a godly man. He sees the problem around him, and he's been in the nation of Israel, we said, for a couple of generations. A couple of kings have come and done evil, and then there's this one king where there's hope with Josiah, and now Josiah has been taken in battle, and so he's dead, and his son takes over, and everything goes right back to the evil again. And Habakkuk sees this, and we're told that God gives him this oracle, or this burden, to see what's happening and to be troubled by it. And he responds to this burden by saying, "God, why aren't you acting? Why aren't you doing something? When are you going to step up and put an end to this?" And so, as a godly man, he's gotten a few things right. First of all, he sees the problem for what it is. He knows the problem that God's laid on his heart, and he's concerned for the evil around him in Israel. It's not evil that directly affects his family or his people, but it's his nation, and he cares. And so he sees it, and he's burdened by it. And he rightly, as a prophet of God, is burdened by the things that burden God's heart. And he responds expecting God to move, expecting God to do something. That's not a bad thing, right? He's got this burden, and he goes to the right source with it. He says, "God, why aren't you doing anything yet? Like, you seem to be not moving too quickly." And so he raises his concern. And that's where we finished last week, with him raising this concern about the evil that he sees, and he longs for the time when things were on track, when Josiah had found the book in the temple and had brought out the book of the law, and the people had started to get back on track and listen to God and worship him. And he longs for that time when things are set right, when justice prevails, when the courts aren't empty of justice like they are in this current day for him. And then we come to this passage, and it almost seems as if God hasn't heard his question at all. It's like God's not answering the question that Habakkuk raised. Habakkuk says, "Things have gone wrong, things are evil. God, why aren't you doing something about this? When are you going to step up and put an end to this? There's evil all around me. Why do I have to watch it?" That's what he says. "Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight." That's the situation he finds himself in. There's evil happening, there's injustice, and he says, "Why do I have to see this? Like this is a burden to me, to watch what's playing out among the people that are supposed to be the people of God." And then the Lord replies, but the Lord doesn't reply and say, "It's okay, listen, Habakkuk, things are going to get better." What does he say? The Lord replies and says, "Look around at the nations, look and be amazed, for I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it." Habakkuk says, why do I have to look at this evil around me in Israel? Why do I have to look at this? Why do I have to see this? And God says to him, look around at the nations. Like, he's looking at the nation of Israel, and God says, you need to look beyond the borders of that. Look around at the nations, look and be amazed. I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't even believe if someone told you about it. I'm about to do something really unbelievable. Here it is, Habakkuk, you say things are bad in Israel, but look around you, look further than that. Widen your perspective. And what's happening around you? What's happening beyond that? He says, there's even greater evil than the stuff you've been looking at. I'm about to raise up the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are fierce and brutal. They're savage, and they run over everything. You talk about injustice, but these guys scoff at kings. You talk about the injustice that that the people around you in Israel aren't surrendering to the true authority of God, but these people out there, they're even more evil, and they're even more wanton, and they're not responding. You talk about no justice in the courts within Israel, but even kings can't stop the Babylonians. They scoff at all kinds of rulers and authorities, and they're going to do whatever they want to do, and what they want to do is violence and destruction even bigger than you've seen and complained about in Israel. He takes the question, and he seems to answer Habakkuk with a bigger version of the question that Habakkuk had raised. Habakkuk says, why do I have to look at this? And God says, look at that. Habakkuk raises a local concern within Israel, and God raises this global concern. Habakkuk sees evil around him, and God says, there's evil everywhere, not just in Israel. And then God says, you won't believe what I'm going to do because I'm taking action in this. I will do something about the evil in Israel. But what I'm going to do, you're not even going to buy. You're not going to believe it. If somebody had told you in advance, you'd say, God would never do that. See, God says that his perspective, although he's seeing evil for what it is and calling it out, even though he's troubled by all the right things, the fact that there's injustice and unfairness among Israel, and that they're focused on the wrong things, and that they're getting caught up in other religions and other ways of dealing with their lives, even though they're doing all the wrong things, and he sees it, and as a godly man, he's troubled by it. The trouble is the trouble that God's given him, that God's laid on his heart. He says to Habakkuk, look, you're seeing this much, but there's more going on than that. There's evil that spreads further than that. Habakkuk says it's not fair in Israel anymore. And God points out that it's not fair anywhere. He pushes Habakkuk to see a broader perspective, to see more than he sees, to realize that what he looks at, he's troubled by, and he should be troubled by it. And what he looks at, he brings in to God and says, here's what I'm seeing, and here's what's wrong, and I'm troubled by that. And he tells God, and God's the right person to turn to when things like that are going on. And he doesn't like the fact that things are unfair and unjust. That bothers him, and it should bother him. And so he takes the burden that God's laid on his heart, and he brings it back to God, and he says, what are you going to do, God? And why does it seem like you're not moving on this? And God says, look beyond the boundaries of Israel. Look at all the nations. Consider the fact that I've got the whole world to deal with here. Habakkuk, you're worried about more than just your little circle, and that's good that you can see further than that. But you need to understand, as far as your vision sees, and as much as you're concerned for the world around you, your perspective is limited in comparison to mine. I see things you don't see. And I'm planning things that you would not understand. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, and they're going to deal with the evil in Israel. And there's going to be a reckoning, but you're going to be troubled by it. You're not going to believe what I'm going to do, because I'm raising up these people. And he says, it's not that I think the Babylonians are innocent, and it's not that I believe that they're the ones that I stand behind and I stand behind their actions. In fact, he says they're deeply evil. They're deeply guilty. They're deeply guilty, for their God is their own strength. They're trusting in their own strength. The thing that they worship is the fact that they can get away with this, that they can overpower other people. And because they can, they think that's a good thing. I'm in charge here because I can overpower other people with our military might. And so they trust in their own accomplishments, their own ability to make things go their way. And God says, that's a problem too. But I am going to raise them up, and I'm going to deal with Israel. But I see things from a broader perspective, and there are things that you can't understand. Why would I use the Babylonians when they're even worse than the evil people in Israel? You wouldn't get it. Because I'm God, and you, Habakkuk, are a good man, a godly man. You're a prophet. You speak for me. But you don't understand what I understand, and you don't see what I see. Habakkuk's problem is the violence and destruction, and that there's no justice, but all of those things are perpetuated in the whole world. And again, we see as human beings the injustice that people treat each other unfairly. And sometimes we get caught up in that and we go, God, it's not fair. I see things that aren't fair. And we might be concerned for more than just ourselves, but as much as we can take on a godly perspective and see things through God's eyes and be concerned for the things that concern God, we will never understand all the things that God is concerned about. We only see so much. And we only understand even less than we see. So Habakkuk does the right thing in bringing it to God, but God points out to him that he will never fully comprehend what's going on. The Babylonians are ruthless because they promote their own honor, and Judah's rulers have been promoting their own honor. They're kind of the same, but just a different degree. He's troubled by the things that surround him, but God's troubled by evil and injustice everywhere it exists. And so it isn't as simple as punishing everybody at the same time. He inserts himself in the affairs of human beings, but it's a complex kind of system going on, right? There's good things and bad things, and it's never as simple as the way we look at it. God's got his ways, and he deals with things in his time, but sometimes his timing doesn't look like our timing. And so Habakkuk is troubled by what he sees, but he doesn't see everything. And so God shows up and responds to Habakkuk, but his response, I think if we were sitting in Habakkuk's shoes, would be a little less than satisfying. We see injustice around us. I mean, we encounter injustice every time we go to the grocery store, don't we? You know, when you're lining up and there's just one or two cashiers, and then all of a sudden 3 lines open up, and the people who just got here get in line in front of you, or that guy that comes barreling down the on-ramp, and instead of waiting his turn, he shoots on out beyond traffic and cuts in front of you, and you've been waiting, inching along, and suddenly he's halfway home, it seems. Stuff like that happens, not just in small ways, but in big ways that catch the evening news and trouble us. It shouldn't be that way. Those things shouldn't happen. We talked about the residential schools last week, and those are things that we see and we go, there's great evil in the world. People treat each other horribly. And there's injustice, and we don't like it. And if we even catch a glimpse of what the heart of God is, it should bother us deeply. And we should carry those things. They should be our burdens, our oracles. But we always have to understand when we're troubled by things, when we see things that we think shouldn't be, and especially when it seems like God is inactive, or worse, he's doing stuff like raising up evil people in Babylon who are even worse than the evil people he's about to deal with in Israel. That we would say, God is God and we aren't. We would understand that his ways are far above our ways. We would get that his perspective and the things that he sees are things that even if he explained it to us, we couldn't wrap our minds around. And yet, he promises action. It's not that he's doing nothing, he's doing something, but we don't see the perspective. We don't see the timeline. We don't see when he's going to deal with what. It's not that he's blind when evil people seem to get away with things. Babylon will get their due. He says they're deeply evil. Their God is their strength. They're on the wrong track. They believe in the wrong stuff. They're focusing on the wrong solution to the problems in their world, and they are deeply guilty. Don't think I didn't notice. I notice what's going on in Israel, and I notice what's going on in Babylon, and I notice what's going on in the nations. Look beyond your little world, Habakkuk, and you will realize I've got all kinds of situations to deal with. And I care about every one of them. You're burdened by what I burdened you with, and that's good. You see what I asked you to see, what I've laid before your eyes. It's good that you're looking at that. But when you get troubled that it seems like I don't have a plan here, look beyond. Just enough to glimpse, not so that you can understand what's happening there either, but so that you will understand that you don't understand. And you don't get what I get. And it's bigger than you see. But I will deal with it all in my own time. Habakkuk says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry to you, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch this misery?" He wants to close his eyes and wake up, and it's all dealt with. And God says, I gave you that burden for a reason. But understand that I have more than that. And I think sometimes we look at our world and we see trouble and we say, why doesn't God act? And we want to trust him, but we either ignore all those issues happening out there, or we get so weighted down with them that we're kind of upset with God for not doing something and not acting. And sometimes we can set it aside and say, well, I just won't look at it then. I don't know what God's doing, but he must be doing something, and I guess I'll just ignore it. And neither one of those extremes is really the answer. God says, look, watch. You're looking at evil and being troubled by it. That's good. Keep doing that. But be willing to broaden your perspective. Be willing to see beyond what troubles you to the whole world. And know that I am in it all, and that I am acting, and it may seem like I'm not active, or it even may seem worse than that. It may seem like I'm doing things, but I'm doing the wrong things. Understand I know what I'm doing. And trust me in this, Habakkuk. It can be hard to trust God when we don't understand what he's doing. It can be really hard to see things and be troubled by them, and we can be tempted to either ignore them or to get so upset that we find it really hard to trust God. And God says, look at it, be bothered by it, do the right things, but see beyond just your circumstance. And see beyond just what happens to you or your family or friends, and also just what happens beyond the borders of even your country. Care about what I care about, and I care about everything and everyone. And know that I am looking after things and that I see what's happening. And I may not do what you expect, but I see the guilty and I see the innocent. I see those who wallow in injustice and trust their own strength. But Habakkuk, there's something else that's better than your strength to trust in. You're a prophet, Habakkuk. You speak for me. You know who I am, and you expect me to have the strength to do something, but you don't understand the things that I know about what I should be doing at any given time. You don't understand the timeline that I've laid out and how I'm going to draw all this together and how I'm going to deal with Israel, and I'm going to deal with Babylon, and I'm going to deal with all the evil in the world. And you may not see it, but you can trust it. And so God says he's going to raise up the Babylonians, and they're so unfair, but he says they're deeply guilty. They're God's their own strength. And that's not how we look at it, right? That's not how we go about our business. We don't trust in our strength. We don't trust in our wisdom. But we trust a God who knows what he's doing and sees things that we don't see and understands things that we don't understand. And his timing can seem way off to us, but it's perfect timing. And he will do what needs doing when the time is right. And the guilty will be punished, and those who are innocent will be upheld. And he will draw all things in his time. Let's pray together. God, this morning we confess that we, like Habakkuk, sometimes see evil and are troubled by it. And we know that the burden for that evil is something that you've laid on our hearts, that you don't want us to ignore the fact that there's evil around us. You don't want us to cocoon in our own safe little world and ignore the fact that there are problems out there. You want us to be engaged and concerned, and at times you call us to be involved. But whenever we get involved, when we lay ourselves out there, when we see the concerns and carry them in our hearts, we are tempted at times to question your actions and inactions. And even when we're reminded that you do all things in your time, we sometimes feel, we confess, that you're slow in acting and that you don't seem to be doing the things that you need to do in the timing that we think you should do them. But when we're honest, we realize that you have a broader perspective than we do. You see things that we don't see, and you understand things that we just could not comprehend, even if someone explained it to us. But we have seen enough of you in action. We have seen your mercy and your grace, and we have seen you do things that bring redemption. And so when we don't see those things, help us to have the faith to trust you. Not that we would never bring you our questions or our concerns like Habakkuk did. We believe that he was on the right track in doing that he was coming to the right source. But that we would listen closely for your voice, and when you challenge us to see things more broadly than we do, when you challenge us with the limit of our understanding, that we would take that admonishment, that we would be willing to trust when we don't see, and understand that you will deal with all of those issues in the world, and that you will bring justice and hope and mercy and grace in its time. You have promised us that you would watch over us, and sometimes we are a little anxious because we're limited, because we're just human beings. Help us to understand that you are so much bigger and stronger and wiser than we are, and that we would lay all things in your hands and know that you can look after it and that you will make it right. Help us to have that kind of faith, to hear how you admonished Habakkuk, and that when our perspective is small, that you would stretch it and challenge it, that we would never get so caught up in our own ideas and our own perspective that we are never willing to be pushed by you and stretched and challenged, so that we see things more and more each day from your point of view, understanding that all things fall under your lordship, that you are king of the entire universe, and that you know what you're doing. Help us to leave things in your hands when we can't see what's happening around us. Amen.